Stand at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue today. It is quiet. Wind passes through the shattered windows of the massive City Methodist Church. Tree roots tear upward through cracked asphalt, fracturing the sidewalks. Entire blocks of commercial storefronts sit hollowed out, roofs caved in under decades of neglect. Less than a century ago, the ground beneath this exact spot vibrated with the mechanical force of the American dream. At its peak, Gary, Indiana, wasn't just a functioning municipality. It was an industrial utopia its founders promoted as the city of the century. Over 200,000 people once lived here. The night sky glowed a relentless orange from the blast furnaces of the largest steel mill on the planet. Wealth poured through the streets, financing grand theaters and towering hotels. This place was so culturally alive and economically secure, it birthed global icons like the Jackson 5. Today, Gary's population has collapsed by more than half. The wealth evaporated, leaving thousands of buildings abandoned. To understand how a booming American metropolis just disappears, and to explore the histories of modern ruins, hit subscribe. We have a lot of ground to cover. In 1906, there was no town here. There was only a stretch of barren sand dunes and dense marshland along the southern shore of Lake Michigan. Then, the United States Steel Corporation arrived. Backed by J.P. Morgan, U.S. Steel was the first billion-dollar corporation in history. The board of directors needed a central manufacturing hub on an unprecedented scale. They chose this desolate strip of Indiana shoreline for its geography. It sat directly between the iron ore mines of the northern Great Lakes and the coal fields of the south. The construction was total environmental engineering. U.S. Steel didn't just build a factory, they altered the geography. They pushed the Grand Calumet River out of its natural bed to make room for the mills, leveled sand dunes with steam shovels, and drained the swamps. Millions of cubic yards of earth were displaced in months. Within a few years, the Gary Works facility emerged. Stretching for miles along the lakefront, it was an industrial fortress, lined with massive smokestacks and a maze of railways. A mill that size required tens of thousands of workers, and those workers needed a place to live. U.S. Steel decided to build a city from scratch, naming it Gary after the corporation's founding chairman, Elbert H. Gary. The executives in New York didn't want a primitive company town of cheap wooden shacks. They wanted a showpiece that projected stability and corporate benevolence. Planners laid out wide, paved avenues in a strict grid. They installed modern sewers, streetlights, and a state-of-the-art electrical system. U.S. Steel poured millions into civic infrastructure, constructing public buildings clad in expensive limestone and brick. Municipal blueprints from 1910 show architecture designed specifically to awe the public. The corporation formed the Gary Land Company to execute this. This subsidiary controlled every real estate transaction within city limits. They zoned commercial districts, built schools, and funded the City Methodist Church, a sprawling Gothic revival masterpiece that cost $1 million to complete in the 1920s. Every brick laid in the town's early days was financed and monitored by the steel giant. Word of this industrial utopia spread fast. The promise of steady work drew waves of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Soon after, the mills pulled thousands of black families from the rural South during the Great Migration. Men arrived with nothing but a suitcase, walked up to the mill gates, and found themselves working full-time the very next day. By 1920, the population had exploded, and by 1930, Gary was officially the fastest-growing city in the nation. It was a gold rush. Past the Great Depression, the post-World War II boom hit the 1950s in full swing. Gary hummed with an energy that rivaled Chicago. The mills operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Train cars packed with raw materials rolled into the rail yards in a heavy stream. The furnaces pumped out the millions of tons of steel that built America's cars and skyscrapers. Strong union wages flooded the local economy. Main Street was packed shoulder to shoulder with shoppers. Downtown Gary had luxury department stores, all-night diners, and grand movie palaces. It was an active metropolis with a massive middle class. Over on Jackson Street, a tiny two-bedroom house sat at number 2300. Inside, Joe and Catherine Jackson were raising a growing family. Joe operated a massive crane at the nearby Inland Steel Company. Like tens of thousands of other residents, his family depended entirely on the steel industry. Out of that cramped space, the Jackson 5 soon emerged, broadcasting the cultural energy of this working-class city to the globe. Gary was on top of the world. It felt invincible. But Gary, Indiana, was fatally tethered to a single corporate master. U.S. Steel wasn't just the primary employer, it was the sole economic engine. The city had no diversified industry, no agricultural output, and no independent financial district. It was a monoculture, a massive metropolis entirely dependent on the global demand for a single commodity. This created a dangerous power imbalance. Gary had elected mayors, city councils, and local judges, but they held almost zero economic leverage. True power lived in corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away in Pittsburgh and New York. The executives setting production quotas and payroll budgets didn't live in Gary. They didn't send their kids to the local schools or breathe the sulfur-tinged air. To local workers, Gary was a hometown. To the executives, it was an asset on a balance sheet. This relationship functioned as long as profits soared. The corporation tolerated high union wages and paid the massive property taxes that funded the city's infrastructure. In turn, the city maintained the roads that got workers to the mill gates on time. But beneath this mid-century prosperity, the mills were aging. Heavy machinery from the early 20th century was becoming obsolete, and blast furnaces required massive overhauls. The global standard for steel production was evolving. Yet, instead of reinvesting profits to modernize the Gary facilities, executives prioritized immediate shareholder returns. The physical foundation of the city was hollowing out. The momentum of the post-war boom masked this neglect for years. Civic pride remained high. High school basketball teams won state championships, local unions wielded political power, and the furnaces kept roaring. But the global steel market was shifting. Competitors in Europe and Asia were rebuilding their industries from scratch using new automated technology. Meanwhile, the cost of American labor was steadily rising. The golden era of the 1950s and 60s was a precipice. The city's entire existence rested on a global market it couldn't control. Eventually, the distant board of directors looked at the sprawling mills, the union workforce, and the aging city they built from the sand up, and simply decided it was no longer worth the cost of maintenance. In the mid-1960s, Gary's union halls were thick with cigarette smoke and absolute confidence. Men stood shoulder to shoulder holding paychecks that guaranteed a middle-class life, swapping stories. After a brutal shift at the mills, production numbers were breaking records. Over 8 million tons of steel rolled out of the Gary Works facility in a single year. From the outside, the boom was deafening, and unending prosperity looked like a sure thing. But the corporate ledgers told a different story. U.S. Steel executives were operating on borrowed time. Gary still relied heavily on open hearth furnaces, an aging mid-century technology. It required massive manual labor, extreme energy consumption, and roughly 10 to 12 hours to process a single batch of steel. Meanwhile, competitors in West Germany and Japan were rebuilding from scratch using basic oxygen furnaces. This automated process yielded the exact same amount of steel in just 45 minutes. It was faster, required a fraction of the workforce, and was radically cheaper. The executives in New York and Pittsburgh knew this. They could have reinvested their record profits back into Gary, tearing down the obsolete furnaces and installing modern equipment to keep the city competitive. Instead, they extracted the cash. Capital was siphoned out of the Indiana mills to pay high dividends and diversify into other industries, like chemicals and real estate. Gary wasn't being maintained, it was being milked. This extraction immediately hit the city's tax base. Gary's schools, paved roads, and public parks were largely funded by property taxes levied on the steel mill. But as U.S. Steel let its heavy machinery age and become obsolete, they sent in corporate attorneys to aggressively fight their local tax assessments. They argued that because their equipment was depreciating, their taxes should drop, and they won. The corporation that built the city was now starving its budget. The physical toll showed up fast. Potholes on Broadway went unfilled. Transit funding dwindled. Desperate to balance the books, the municipal government shifted the burden directly onto local homeowners, and property taxes spiked. This financial strain collided with Gary's rigid segregation. A hard geographical line separated the middle-class white neighborhoods on the south side from the predominantly black central and northern districts. With workers still arriving from the Great Migration, the central districts became severely overcrowded. Families were boxed in by institutional redlining, denied traditional bank loans, and restricted from buying homes in the expanding southern footprint. This pressure cooker created an opening for blockbusting. Real estate agents intentionally stoked racial panic among white homeowners living near the segregation lines. They passed out flyers warning of property value collapses and hired black women to walk baby carriages down all white streets to trigger panic selling. Fearing financial ruin, white families sold their homes at bargain prices. The agents then flipped those exact same properties at a massive premium to black families desperate for space. But because traditional banks wouldn't issue mortgages to these new buyers, agencies sold the homes on predatory land contracts. The buyer built zero equity. If a family missed a single payment from a mill injury or a temporary layoff, the agency instantly evicted them, kept the cash, and flipped the house to the next desperate family. It was a massive engineered extraction of wealth. Within a few years, thousands of middle-class white residents packed up and moved past the city limits into entirely separate suburbs, taking their tax dollars and disposable income with them. Downtown retail collapsed. The massive neon signs outside the movie palaces flickered out. Gary was left to maintain a sprawling, aging infrastructure grid with a shrinking pool of taxpayers, while its largest corporation continued to slash its own contributions. The Civic Foundation was fracturing, and the tension finally spilled into City Hall. For decades, Gary's politics had been run by an entrenched machine that favored the business establishment and the segregated status quo. Then came the 1967 mayoral election. Richard Hatcher, a young, reform-minded city councilman and attorney, mobilized a voting bloc historically shut out of power. He promised to clean up municipal corruption, integrate resources, and force the steel giant to pay its fair share. The local establishment panicked. Despite intense pushback and severe voter suppression funded by local business interests, Hatcher won. He became one of the first black mayors of a major American city. The streets erupted. For a brief moment, it felt like the citizens of Gary had finally seized control of their own destiny. They had defeated the machine, but Hatcher was inheriting a hollowed-out prize. Victory at the ballot box couldn't rewrite the global economy. Just as his administration took office, U.S. Steel's refusal to modernize finally hit the shoreline. Foreign competitors flooded the American market with cheaper, higher-quality steel. The domestic monopoly shattered. Pittsburgh executives watched their market share plummet and drafted emergency plans to protect their bottom line. Saving Gary wasn't on the agenda. The new local administration was trapped. They had won the political war, but they held zero economic leverage. They were supposed to integrate a city actively being abandoned by its middle class, maintain infrastructure crumbling under corporate tax evasion, and rely on a single industry about to trigger one of the largest labor purges in American history. They were handed the keys to the city just as the architects decided to dismantle the machine. Check the corporate ledgers from the early 1970s. A quiet shift was taking place inside the distant boardrooms of U.S. Steel. The executives running the massive operations along the Indiana shoreline weren't traditional industrialists anymore. They were financiers. To them, Gary's aging blast furnaces and heavy union contracts weren't American assets worth modernizing. They were just bloated liabilities. Instead of reinvesting profits to upgrade Gary Works and fight off highly automated foreign steel, corporate leadership diversified. They siphoned capital straight out of the steel sector. The wealth generated by Gary's workers bought chemical companies, real estate, and eventually a multi-billion-dollar petroleum conglomerate. The profits extracted from the Indiana shoreline went to assets thousands of miles away. Gary wasn't just neglected, it was liquidated. For half a century, shift change at the mill was a deafening display of civic momentum. Thousands of workers flooded the turnstiles while heavy rail cars screeched along the tracks. The air literally vibrated. Then the gates went quiet. U.S. Steel began a cold-blooded labor reduction. Not an overnight closure, but a methodical dismemberment. Entire departments shuttered. Production lines consolidated. A heavy machinery operation that used to need 40 union laborers could suddenly be managed by a single technician at a control board. Tens of thousands of high-paying jobs vanished in just a few years. The massive employee parking lots sat empty. Behind the desk in the mayor's office, the city's first black administration was steering a municipality rapidly losing its sole economic engine. City Hall inherited a crisis. Local government completely depended on the tax revenue from those union paychecks. As job losses accelerated, the municipal budget collapsed. Desperate, the administration pivoted. If heavy industry was abandoning them, they'd turn Gary into a service and convention economy. They secured millions in federal grants to build the Genesis Convention Center downtown. The strategy was clear: bring in outside visitors, fill local hotels, and generate commercial tax revenue to build a new foundation. But a convention center needs restaurants, secure transit lines, and private investment to survive. And private capital had completely embargoed the city. The institutional redlining that historically restricted residential neighborhoods was now strangling the commercial sector. Major financial institutions looked at Gary's plummeting tax base and rising unemployment and simply drew a red line around the municipal boundary. They refused to underwrite commercial loans for almost any business with a Gary zip code. Entrepreneurs wanting to open a diner near the convention center were denied capital. Hardware stores couldn't get bridge loans. Traditional commerce was choked off at the root. Downtown decayed at terrifying speed. The luxury department stores on Broadway that once rivaled Chicago's commercial districts pulled out completely, leaving cavernous, empty spaces. Movie palaces were chained shut. Without bank loans, local property owners couldn't afford basic maintenance. Roofs leaked and facades crumbled. Starved of property taxes, local government couldn't police the abandoned buildings or maintain the utility grids. The city fell into a financial death spiral. U.S. Steel deployed armies of corporate attorneys to slash their remaining property tax assessments, arguing their heavily downsized facility was only worth a fraction of its former value. The local tax burden shifted onto a rapidly shrinking residential population that simply couldn't pay. When a single industry town loses its industry, the population doesn't disappear overnight. Families are trapped. Mortgages still need to be paid and groceries bought. When the legal economy evaporates, an illicit one rapidly fills the void. By the mid-1980s, the crack epidemic swept through the industrial ruins of the Rust Belt. Gary, with its hollowed-out commercial sector and staggering unemployment, was an easy target. Underground syndicates moved in to control the city's new illicit markets. The financial stakes in the shadow economy were massive, and territorial control was ruthlessly enforced. Without a fully funded police force, entire neighborhoods were surrendered to organized syndicates. Streets that once buzzed with union organizers and steelworkers became the backdrop for heavily armed turf disputes. Local emergency rooms were completely overwhelmed. By the end of the decade, Gary recorded the highest per capita murder rate in the country. National media descended on the city, but they didn't come to cover corporate abandonment or commercial redlining. They came for shock value. They broadcasted images of physical decay and staggering crime. Gary was branded the nation's most dangerous city. The stigma was immediate and economically devastating. Any remaining regional tourists who might have attended an event at the new convention center stayed away. Federal grants dried up. The middle-class exodus turned into a panicked evacuation. Anyone with the financial means left the city, abandoning their homes to foreclosure or leaving them vacant to be stripped of copper wiring by scavengers. The population collapsed, and the tax base hit absolute rock bottom. The massive City Methodist Church, once a crown jewel of civic pride, was locked up and left to rot. By the 1990s, the local government was drowning in tens of millions of dollars of debt. Traditional avenues of economic recovery were closed. City Hall needed an immediate injection of cash just to keep the streetlights on and the remaining fire stations running. When a city is pushed to the edge of bankruptcy, its leaders abandon conventional planning for high-risk gambles. They listen to any developer pitching a miracle cure. In the 1990s, a new wave of opportunists arrived in Gary, promising to save the city with massive, heavily subsidized entertainment projects. They promised a golden revival. But Gary was about to bet its last dollar on a rigged game. By the early 1990s, the municipal ledgers inside Gary City Hall read like a financial autopsy. The local government wasn't just managing a decline, it was actively fighting off total bankruptcy. The traditional industrial base was gutted and commercial corridors were permanently shuttered. The tax revenue required to run a functional city simply didn't exist. City planners were working with a decimated budget. They faced thousands of abandoned properties, crippling pension obligations, and zero organic investment from major banks. When traditional economics fail, desperation dictates public policy. Gary needed cash immediately just to keep the traffic lights on and the fire stations running. That vulnerability set the stage for a disastrous era of municipal gambling. Outside developers arrived at Lake Michigan with slick architectural renderings and promises of a golden revival. Their pitch? Legalized gaming. Indiana had just authorized riverboat casinos, and Gary's industrialized waterfront made it an ideal host site. The developers sold the local administration a highly specific vision. 2 gaming boats moored in a newly dredged harbor, bringing thousands of jobs and a steady stream of Chicago tourists. Best of all, they promised millions in direct tax revenue for the city's starving general fund. It sounded like salvation, but the actual development agreements were brutal. To secure these entertainment projects, the financially starved local government was pressured into heavily subsidizing the initial footprint. The city bonded out millions to prepare the infrastructure. improving access roads, upgrading waterfront utility grids, and handing out long-term tax abatements to guarantee the operator's commitment. The developers leveraged Gary's desperation to eliminate their own risk. The casinos did generate revenue. Hundreds of millions flowed across the gaming tables in the late 1990s, but the promised economic catalyst never materialized for the broader city. These complexes were designed as self-contained fortresses. Visitors drove in on newly paved state highways, parked in secure garages, spent their money inside isolated floating pavilions, and drove straight back to Illinois. They never set foot in downtown Gary. They didn't eat at local diners or shop in local stores. Profits were immediately funneled out of state to corporate parent companies. The new local jobs were largely low-wage service positions, entirely detached from the wealth creation happening inside the counting rooms. The city traded its remaining leverage for a fraction of the gaming tax and completely failed to revive the central districts. This predatory dynamic repeated across multiple failed urban renewal initiatives throughout the decade. Millions of federal and state grant dollars were still technically flowing into the city, earmarked for residential stabilization and commercial revitalization. But a huge percentage of this public funding was immediately absorbed by outside consulting firms and out-of-town contractors. They charged exorbitant fees to draft endless feasibility studies, environmental surveys, and strategic master plans. They produced heavy binders full of colorful charts for proposed pedestrian malls and luxury housing developments, ideas that completely ignored the harsh reality of a frozen credit market. The projects rarely broke ground. When they did, execution was abysmal. Unscrupulous officials and politically connected developers routinely siphoned off construction budgets, leaving behind half-finished concrete foundations and empty, fenced-off lots. One high-profile initiative aimed to redevelop a large tract of downtown real estate into a commercial plaza. The city spent years acquiring the land, clearing lots, and paying heavy consultant fees. It ultimately yielded a barren strip of cracked pavement that sat vacant for another 2 decades. The grant money evaporated, the developers moved on to the next vulnerable municipality, and Gary was left holding the bill for the site preparation. This misallocation of resources accelerated the city's physical decay past the point of no return. Without a fully funded public works department to board up vacant structures or enforce building codes, Gary's architectural legacy began to literally cave in on itself. Take the Gary Union Station. Built in 1910, this neoclassical masterpiece was once a bustling cast concrete gateway for hundreds of thousands of immigrants and steelworkers. By the late 1990s, it was a gutted shell. Scavengers methodically stripped the copper wiring, brass fixtures, and structural iron beams to sell to local scrap yards for pennies on the dollar. The roof fractured, pouring rainwater into the Grand Concourse. Today, it stands as a ruined, overgrown monument to civic neglect. Then, there was the City Methodist Church. At its height, this $1 million Gothic revival sanctuary seated thousands of parishioners under soaring, hand-carved vaulted ceilings. But as the congregation fled and the surrounding tax base collapsed, basic maintenance became impossible. The heavy doors were padlocked and the structure was quietly abandoned. In 1997, a catastrophic fire tore through the sanctuary. The local fire department, chronically underfunded and operating with aging equipment, couldn't save the roof. Heavy timber trusses collapsed inward. Stained glass windows shattered under the extreme heat, leaving the nave entirely exposed to the elements. Decades of Midwestern snow and rain slowly eroded the stone pillars, transforming a sacred community anchor into a highly dangerous ruin, right in the middle of downtown. This severe structural collapse wasn't limited to grand public monuments. It happened systematically across the entire residential grid. Satellite maps from the late 1990s compared to mid-century blueprints show dense, tightly packed neighborhoods transforming into an urban prairie. Foreclosed, vacant homes became prime targets for arson and illegal dumping. Entire blocks burned. Because the local government couldn't afford the heavy equipment required to demolish the shells, nature violently reclaimed the concrete. Ivy choked the brick facades of collapsed row houses. Invasive trees tore through the foundations of former grocery stores. Wild grass grew 6 feet high in empty lots where generations of union laborers once raised their families. The sheer scale of the abandonment was dizzying. Miles of residential streets reverted to wilderness, leaving isolated, surviving homes completely surrounded by the skeletal remains of a dead industrial empire. The math of this era is brutal. By the turn of the millennium, Gary's population had dropped by more than 50% from its historic peak. Over 100,000 people had simply vanished from the city limits, leaving behind a sprawling, toxic footprint, bleeding tens of millions of dollars in municipal debt. The city of the century was effectively erased from the modern American consciousness. It was no longer a functioning component of the national economy. Regional planners had written it off as an irredeemable wasteland. But the wealth extracted from this sand dune over a century didn't just evaporate into the polluted soil. It built towering skyscrapers in New York. It financed global corporate acquisitions. It enriched distant shareholders and out-of-town developers. As the remaining citizens of this hollowed-out metropolis navigate streets surrendered to decay, you have to ask, was a single executive, developer, or corporate board member ever held accountable for the devastation? Or does the modern global economy let the architects of a utopia simply walk away when the well runs dry? Walk onto the Horace Mann High School campus today. It's dead quiet. This 3-story brick behemoth once educated thousands of middle-class kids. It had well-funded science labs, an Olympic swimming pool, and a massive theater. Now, it's a hollow shell. Rain pours through the collapsed roof and pools on the gymnasium floor. Lockers rust into warped floorboards. Thick green vines creep through shattered windows, strangling the exposed steel beams. Nature doesn't negotiate. It just takes it back. To understand the physical reality of extreme corporate abandonment, you just have to look at the landscape of this forgotten city. Gary isn't just a town in an economic slump. It's an environmental ruin. Decades without public maintenance have turned huge chunks of the residential grid into an urban wilderness. Walk down the historic Morningside district. These streets used to have manicured lawns and grand brick colonial mansions for shift managers and executives. Now, half those homes are swallowed by overgrowth. Saplings tear through cracked driveways. Feral dogs roam unpaved alleys. Block after block of what was once the most heavily engineered infrastructure in the country is reverting to the marshland it was a century ago. But the worst damage is underground. The sand dunes and wetlands that were dredged and flattened to build this industrial utopia weren't just paved over, they were poisoned. For generations, shoreline operations pumped a steady stream of heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, and industrial waste straight into the ecosystem. When the mills downsized, the extraction stopped. The toxic footprint stayed. The Grand Calumet River, artificially rerouted by steam shovels a century ago to make room for blast furnaces, is choked with lead, arsenic, and petroleum waste. The soil across the northern neighborhoods is packed with industrial toxins. U.S. Steel used this land to generate historic wealth. When that wealth was fully extracted, they handed the environmental check to the taxpayers. The local government, already drowning in debt and unable to afford basic street paving, was suddenly on the hook for massive soil remediation. The math simply doesn't work. Still, people live here. Tens of thousands of residents navigate these left-to-rot streets every single day. Life as a homeowner in Gary is a constant grind. You're living in a city built for a population that doesn't exist anymore. The underground infrastructure, the water mains, the sewer grid, miles of electrical wiring, was designed for over 200,000 people. Today, it serves a fraction of that. You can't shrink a city's physical footprint just because the people leave. The remaining residents have to carry the financial weight of maintaining a ghost grid. Water pressure drops because there aren't enough active faucets to keep the mains flowing. Potholes swallow entire intersections because public works can't afford the asphalt to pave hundreds of miles of empty streets. Basic businesses are just gone. Grocery chains and pharmacies abandoned the city limits years ago. Gary is a massive food desert. To buy fresh produce or pick up a prescription, residents often have to drive miles into neighboring suburbs. It's a brutal cycle. The few dollars still generated inside Gary are immediately spent outside of it, starving the local tax base even more. They are trapped inside the carcass of a dead industrial empire. How does a billion-dollar utopian project end up like this? How does a city that built the skyline of modern America get completely erased from the national consciousness? The tragedy of Gary isn't an isolated anomaly, it's a blueprint. Strip away the local political battles and the failed revitalization schemes, and you're left with an ugly systemic reality. Modern corporate law is specifically designed to allow this exact type of devastation. It's the ultimate legal shield. The executives sitting in high-rise boardrooms hundreds of miles away didn't break the law when they stopped maintaining the mills. They didn't violate municipal codes when they diverted profits, generated by local laborers, into foreign portfolios. They were operating under a strictly financial mandate to maximize shareholder returns. The system functioned exactly as engineered. A massive corporation can build a municipality from the ground up. It can dictate the city's culture, shape its geography, and monopolize its labor force. But the moment that town stops being profitable, the corporation can completely detach from the physical and social consequences of leaving. There is no law requiring an industry to dismantle the residential ruins it leaves behind. Nobody from the board was ever brought before a federal judge to answer for a collapsed housing market, and no executive bonus was ever clawed back to clean up heavy metals leaching into the local water table. They just closed their briefcases, reallocated their capital, and walked away. The architects of the collapse faced zero consequences. They stayed wealthy, insulated, and totally removed from the physical fallout of their financial decisions. The public scrutiny, media stigma, and crushing municipal debt fell exclusively on the families left behind. There's a bitter irony to this shoreline. This exact spot birthed one of the most lucrative entertainment legacies in history. Michael Jackson and his family emerged from a tiny house on Jackson Street, broadcasting an undeniable energy to the globe. The Jackson brand generated billions. It defined generations of American pop culture. But the origin point of all that cultural wealth sits decaying, surrounded by collapsing schools and polluted lots. That money left the city, just like the steel profits and just like the middle-class tax base. Today, Gary stands as a monument to the brutal reality of single-industry boomtowns. It proves a grim fact about the American industrial machine. An industrial utopia is never built to be a permanent home. It's a temporary extraction camp. As long as the resources, including the raw human labor, are profitable to harvest, the camp thrives. The streets get paved, the neon signs glow. But when the global market shifts, the camp is liquidated. The illusion of civic permanence shatters. Drone footage of shattered church roofs, rusted mill turnstiles, and empty, overgrown neighborhoods makes one thing clear. Gary was the absolute peak of 20th century manufacturing power, and it was discarded the moment it became a financial liability. If a massive, productive metropolis can be bled dry and erased from the map without a single architect of its destruction facing accountability, what happens when that exact same corporate blueprint is applied to the cities we live in today?